thing. Does anybody know? Wrong. I'm not going to talk on psychology. What happened to the handkerchief that was here?
I looked around.
Huh?
Anybody have messages?
Thank you. Hi, Tom. Yeah, just bring it up here. Thank you. So it's on meditation, is it? Oh, well. As I left, I looked up recommended topics, and they said something about psychology, East and West. And now I'm supposed to talk on meditation? Well, I can talk on both, I suppose, somehow. The approach of the East and the West to the psychology of the individual, as the great sage Jeeves would put it, is, in fact, it incorporates the meditative aspect from the Eastern standpoint as very vital to it all. We have an idea of the human psyche that is somewhat comparable to the view that people had up until just about 4 centuries ago, of the nature of the universe and the place of mankind and of our little planet in this universe. The ideas of the more primitive peoples were all very limited in their scope as far as time, as far as space went. They thought of the sky as sort of an inverted bowl over a flat earth, and the universe was maybe just lamps suspended in this bowl. All the stars, I mean, or maybe holes in the bowl itself where the divine light was shining through. Various ideas. I think it was until quite recently that, in fact, I'm sure that there are a lot of fundamentalists who still believe that the world was started on September 9th at, I believe, 9:30 in the morning in the year 4004 BC. It was all a fairly cozy picture, and we were able, with this picture, to compose a very comfortable view of the nature of reality. That God was an old man with a flowing beard, and he sat on a throne with Jesus at his right side, and there were all these angels and cherubim and seraphim sort of ranged on a series of steps up toward this dais, and then saints around them all playing their guitars, their harps, and all a very sort of a comfortable human kind of picture, which has been totally blasted in the last few centuries when they discovered that the world wasn't the center of the universe, the sun was. Then they discovered, no, the sun wasn't the center of the universe, and so it must be somewhere in the center of all the stars that we saw. And suddenly we discovered that there were hundreds of billions of galaxies, and that even if there is a center to this galaxy, which they didn't discover until the mid-30s of this century, they still can't speak of a center in the universe, a universe much too vast for us to contemplate with any degree of comprehension with our little brains. We just can't conceive of a reality so totally impersonal, so totally vast, so totally different from anything that we're able to view or perceive with our senses. It doesn't really look the way we see it. It's just our little eyes that make it appear the way it looks. We're susceptible, we're sensitive, I should say, to a very limited range of light vibrations, and that gives us the particular images that we see. But if we saw with the eyes of a fly, if we saw with the eyes of an electron microscope, if we saw in many, many different possible ways of seeing, we would see things totally differently. And who's to say that we see it correctly? We can't make such a claim because we only see such a small spectrum of visible sound waves, sound vibrations. We only hear a very small part of the total spectrum of sound vibrations. And the reality that we perceive of solid matter is actually a total delusion, because matter itself is really only energy. In other words, the view of the universe is so incomprehensibly greater that now we're having to approach it in a very different way. And essentially what science tries to do today is not try to understand things in a reasonable way. Science is satisfied if it's able to discover truths that it can make work. Workable discoveries are about the height of what they're able to aspire to. Well, now we still have the view of the individual as somebody who was born a few years ago and will die in another few years. And this individual constitutes to us the center of his particular universe, which of course he is in a very real sense. This particular individual constitutes more than that, our reality. This person, with his likes and dislikes, with his learning, with his aspirations, with his accomplishments and failures, these are the things that are most important to us, each one. And we see everything more or less in terms of their relationship to this individual, or more specifically ourselves. And yet, we're discovering, and the beginning discovery was made with the advent of psychology, that man has hidden depths, that what he shows on the surface is by no means all that he is. And so we say, well, all right, he is the product of the various impressions that came to him from the way his parents treated him, from the way he grew up, from all the various sense impressions that he received. And the belief is still that he comes into this body a blank slate, and that slate gets written on by his experiences in this life. And we still think of it more or less cozily as this life. But more and more people are beginning to get data that suggests very strongly that man has been around a long time, that he has lived many lifetimes before this life. And there's a lot of support for that. It's been something that people have tossed around for a long time, but the West generally has rejected it. Many philosophers have claimed to believe in it, have said that it's the only explanation of things to which philosophy can even listen. And many great minds have looked upon it as an intriguing thing. Many of them have believed in it. But nevertheless, it hasn't been something that widely accepted, yet more and more now, in this century, particularly in the last few years, we're beginning to find out, first of all, through hypnosis. People have actually, under hypnosis, remembered things. For instance, a friend of mine, under hypnosis, began reciting hymns in Sanskrit and claimed to have been a sadhu in India. And he didn't know Sanskrit at all. In fact, he hardly knew English, although that was his own language. However, a tape recording of the Sanskrit prayers that he uttered under hypnosis proved, when offered to a pundit to listen to have been correct. And there have been many, many such stories, enough to make people begin to think that maybe there is something to this whole idea of reincarnation. And there are more and more episodes of children remembering who they were. And I personally have met many such people whose children, or who, when they were children, remembered. One of them was Brother Premamoy in Encinitas, in Self-Realization Fellowship. When he was a child, his mother brought a new piece of music home and played it on the piano. And he said, "Oh, play it again, Mommy. I know that. It sounds very familiar." And she says, "Well, it couldn't, because I just bought it today. You haven't heard it before." And he said, "No, I know you didn't play it to me, but they used to play it to me. They would, when I lived in a palace, they would take me up on the roof and they would play me this." And the mother thought that he was just being a little liar, and so she took him to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, well, no, these delusions were very normal for children. But how could he believe it? And yet more and more children have been found, and as you see, as this planet shrinks, what we're finding is that there is more and more opportunity to learn what's going on in other parts of the world. And more these stories are coming in, intriguing people enough to start to go out and look for such stories. And there have been quite a few such accounts printed that anybody who's interested is probably aware of already, but if not, has a very good opportunity to become aware of. There was a case in Turkey, for example, that I read about in, I think it was Fate magazine, a young boy who kept claiming to belong to another village. And they didn't believe in reincarnation, but finally, just to shut him up, they took him to that village. It was about 50 miles away, and they'd never been there. And he immediately walked ahead of them and led them to the house that he said he'd lived in, and recognized the people in the house, called them by name, recognized a local merchant who he said owed him money, and then he died and he never paid the family, which was a great embarrassment. In fact, it was an all-round embarrassment for everybody. Apparently, they'd rather that he hadn't come back. But it was a very interesting story. They said that he himself seemed uncannily like the old man who had died. And there was a case that was well publicized a few decades ago of a woman who, well, she was a child in this lifetime, but she remembered being a woman, and she died. Let's see. She remembered in her house that she had hidden some money in the house that she claimed to have lived in. They took her to that house. It was in a distant village, and she took them to where the money had been hidden. And her former husband, who was an older man by now, said yes, he'd found it, but it had been there. And there was the case of one young girl who just couldn't adjust to her parents, because apparently her father had been her husband at some time, I think in the last life. All sorts of very awkward things, but nevertheless many stories that keep coming out all over the world. They're much more likely to surface in India, because as soon as the parents hear this, then of course they already believe in it, and instead of treating it like a delusion, will be more interested in tracing it out, because it will help to support what they believe in. But in the West, if you have a child who believes in that he's lived before, at least until recently, the vast majority of parents would do their best to get him to change his mind. Now, more and more, they're starting to listen to their children when they talk like that, because there are so many books on the subject, and it's no longer considered totally heretical to have such beliefs. So now more and more these thoughts are beginning to surface, and it begins to look as if the reality that we're dealing with as individuals is very much vaster than one lifetime. Just like this universe is so vast compared to what we think it, or used to think it to be, so we too as individuals are much vaster in our complexity than we ever dreamed. Cleaning out things through psychoanalysis is a good thing to do, but what do we observe, first of all, when we see the results of psychoanalysis? Do we find saints? Do we find that people who go through psychoanalysis become enlightened? And if not, then what is really happening? I'm not saying it's not a good thing. It's a good thing for certain people, and it has helped everybody to become aware of certain realities without which they might not have been aware. Not only to become aware, but to be honest enough to face what they're aware of. Not to just say, oh my God, is that so? And then push it away again. But to face it. to accept yourself as you are. It's all doing a lot of good. But if, on the other hand, we view it in the broader spectrum, we find that it's not doing that which is the most important of all. Think of a very large palace with many, many rooms. And you come into a room that's full of dirt, and you say, oh, good, let's get rid of all this dirt, let's get to work. And you sweep and you sweep and you sweep and you sweep it out the door, and you've cleaned the room up and it looks shining and beautiful. And then what? You just swept the dirt into another room. You didn't sweep it out of the palace. And that's what happens when we try to just get rid of particular traits without offering them into this higher flow, which comes with meditation, with superconsciousness. We are just working from one room of the mind to another. We're not getting out of the mind. And it may be a very helpful thing to do, but it will be helpful in the last analysis only if it helps us to get to superconsciousness. If it can clear the mind of immediate obstacles so that we can concentrate and go into a higher state of consciousness. But if we think of it only from a standpoint of the lower coming up from the subconscious, cleaning out the subconscious and trying to get it straightened out, but not getting rid of the delusions that keep us from knowing who we really are, then we may be clear in a certain way, but we're not clear in a divine way. We may get rid of those hang-ups that are preventing us from digesting our food or getting along well with our neighbors. We may feel happy for a while, but that's because we're in this room right now, and the whole mind is much, much faster than you can imagine. If you can imagine the numbers of lifetimes that we live and the impressions that are carried in the mind for all those lives, it says in the Indian scriptures that it takes 5 to 8 million lifetimes for the ego to reach the point, the soul to reach the point where it incarnates in a human body. 5 to 8 million lives coming up through all these lower forms, more or less automatically. In fact, not more or less, entirely automatically, because there isn't the discrimination of the ego developed enough on those lower stages to make a personal effort. And then after you reach this plane, you think, well, now that we've got the intelligence and the discriminative ability to advance spiritually, we should be able to get out of it quickly at last. Well, yes, in a way we can, but the trouble is that we also have the much greater capacity to explore delusions. Animals have a pretty set instinctive pattern, but man can develop all kinds of instinctual patterns. Dogs just run after cars. Man can decide whether or not he shall buy that car or not, in other words. And man has so many different ways of slipping into one mistake after another. He can develop such an infinity of tastes outside any instinctual pattern he might have that he can go on for many, many incarnations. And I would say, although no one has actually dared make the statement, that it's entirely possible, if not probable, that he goes through as many lifetimes after reaching the human level before he gets out of it as he goes through coming up to the human level. I don't know that that's true. I do know that it's true that he goes through an awful lot. And every one of those lifetimes, if you think, psychologists are still trying to explain what we are right now in terms of this lifetime, in terms of the impressions we've picked up in this lifetime. They think that they can explain you in terms of where you grew up and the people you knew and the things that you were subjected to. But this is really like Procruste's bed. You know the story of Procruste's bed, don't you? There was when Theseus, one of the great kings of ancient Greece, when he went to Athens to claim his kingdom, the story was that his father, I believe it was Aegeus, had visited his mother and they fell in love and he had a child by her. And then he had to go back to his kingdom, and the mother stayed there in the forest. Very similar to the story of Shakuntala in India in this respect, but not from now on. Theseus grew up, and when he reached manhood, his mother asked him if he could move a very big, heavy stone slab, and he couldn't do it. So she said, well, you're not ready. And every year he would come back, I think on the date of his birth, whenever it was, to try to move that stone, and couldn't do it. Finally, he reached enough strength to be able to lift that slab, and under it was a sword. And his mother said, now it's time for you to go and tell your father who you are and to claim your inheritance. And so he did. And on his journey, these are all symbolic stories, on his journey he met a succession of evil people. One of these evil people was Procrustes, who pretended to invite him with great love and affection to his house, fed him a sumptuous meal and said, all right, now I'll take you to the guest chamber. Well, this is where the monstrosity of the man came out. The bed was of a particular length, and if a guest fitted the bed exactly, which almost no one ever did, then he was in luck. But if he didn't, then Procrustes had his own methods of making him fit the bed. If he was too long, he would just chop off his legs to the right length, and he'd strap him down, and the guest would bleed to death. And if he was too short, he'd stretch him on a rack until he was long enough, and of course he died that way. And this was the way he got his kicks. Well, Theseus took his sword and managed to kill the man. But this is all really a symbol, an allegorical expression of something that we all tend to do, which is to say we get a theory, and then we try to make the facts fit the theory. And in the process, we usually slaughter the facts. And so the psychologists, with their attempt to explain human nature in terms of just these present realities, are really acting like Procrustes with that bed. Everybody knows, everybody who's had a child knows that every child is born with his own personality. They have their own personalities from birth. And yet, the psychological dogma of this century is that the child is entirely the product of the way it's trained. They think that boy children and girl children are all both exactly the same, and the only difference is that they're brought up with different expectations. Well, every parent knows that isn't so, but they try to act as if it were. Dr. Spock said that little girl babies, when he would lean over them with that little mirror on his forehead, would just look up and admire and enjoy the reflection of light and perhaps of the self in the mirror. And little boy babies would reach up and try to grab the mirror, try to figure out how it was made, and from then on it just keeps going. There are just basic differences that are inbred into people, partly by their hormones, but mostly, of course, by all these incarnations that they've lived before. And any attempt to try to explain a person entirely in terms of his present experiences just doesn't work. It doesn't add up. Just to speak of an example I happen to know is myself. I was brought up in a family where all the values that were ever presented to me were that you should get a good job, have a well-to-do home and family, and just live in suburbia. And I'm sure many of you have gone through this. But in my case, it was even more clear and impression formed because I lived in that little small colony in Teliagin in Romania where we were separated from the Romanian people. We just saw them as if through a glass. But our life was very much a little Anglo-American community within the larger framework of Romania, so that the influences that we were subjected to were very clear-cut, and all of them supportive of this very typical middle-class suburban American life. And yet I grew up from the very beginning not wanting it, always feeling that it wasn't mine. Now, where do those things come from? It becomes very clear when we can accept the teaching of reincarnation. Now, what we have is the influence of the subconscious on who and what we are. And that influence is indeed very strong. But to explain us in terms of that influence and to say that is what we are is a bias that doesn't tell the whole picture either. There's something else that we're reaching out toward. The idea of Darwinian evolution as being just a matter of survival of the fittest and in competition with other life forms for your own existence and survival, that you gradually evolve different things and it puts a premium on certain qualities and certain attributes of the body and so on. To explain it in this way doesn't, for one thing, explain why the human brain is about 3 times as large as that of the largest land animal relative to the size of its body, at least. Doesn't explain that. Why should we have a larger brain? There is something else that is responsible for evolution. It isn't only a push upward from below, it's a reaching out for something that we all know that we need. The dogma in the early part of this century was that if a person could have enough food to eat and a roof over his head, that would be all he needed, all he wanted. And it isn't so. The people who have those are the ones who are, in a sense, the least satisfied. They want something more. They want wisdom. They want love. They want joy. They want to understand what it's all about. They want to reach out, and the mind is never content with what it has and what it knows. It's always wanting more. And this is the soul's native hunger for its origin in God. This is something that we are all born for, born with, I should say. We all long to go back to the source because we came from there. This is what St. Augustine said when he said, "Thou hast made us for thyself. God, thou hast made us for thyself. And our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." This is our need. And if we look at human nature from both standpoints, it's sort of like a telescope. You can look through either end of the telescope, but from one end everything looks small, and from the other end everything looks big. From one end, if you look at men, you see something petty, insignificant. You look at it through the other end and you see something grand. There is such enormous potential in human nature to reach out, to become a child of the infinite, to become infinite. The ability for greatness, the potential for it in man is, it's divine. And if we try to understand man only from the lower, the thing is that we never really help him to solve his problems, because it will always be one problem after another. It will always be sweeping the dirt out of one room of the palace into another room. And you will feel good for a while. You go through some sort of a psychological thing, whether it be an encounter group or whatever else it might be. And as long as you have such a simplistic idea of your life that you think that your present realities are what you are, then you will think, well, I've solved the problem I was having with my wife and now I have no problems. That's just, for a while you may feel good. And if you feel good enough in that solution to be able to go on and try to find something more, something higher, then it's okay. But if you just sit back and think, well, now I've got it made, what you're going to find is that it won't be very long before something else will come along. And it'll just keep going and going and going forever. Yogananda told the story about the man who he had very poor health, and he was a devotee, and when he died, an angel appeared to him, and he was conscious at the moment of death, and the angel said, well, what would you like in your next lifetime? And the man said, well, I've had a very unhealthy body. If you could only give me a healthy body, then I think I'll be well off. And the angel said, is that all you want? He said, yes, that's quite enough, thank you. So the next life he was born with a very healthy body, but no money to feed this healthy, strong body. And he just was constantly hungry. And so in his next life, when death came in that life, the angel said, what do you want now? And the man said, well, Lord, give me a healthy body and a strong body, and give me enough money to be able to feed this body. And the angel said, is that all? Yes, now I have it. So the next time he was born with a healthy body and lots of money, but nobody loved him, and he was dying of loneliness. And so the angel said, well, what do you want now? And he said, well, give me a healthy body, and give me a strong body, and give me lots of money, and give me a wife. The life out of the poor fellow. He just died of frustration and ulcers finally, and then as he was dying, the angel appeared again, and this time he said, what now? And the man said, well, Lord, give me a healthy, strong body, and give me money, and give me a wife, make her a good wife. And so the angel said, is that all? Yes. So the next life, he got a healthy, strong body, and he had lots of money, and he had a good wife, and she was a very good wife, but the trouble was she died after a year. And he just sort of was worshipping her gloves and her handkerchief, and finally, as he was dying, he prayed again for help, and the angel appeared. What now? And he said, well, Lord, I want a healthy body and strong body. Okay. And then I want lots of money, and I want a good wife, and I want her to live a long time. And so the angel said, is that everything? Yes, now I know I have it. So he got a healthy, strong body, and he got lots of money, and he got a very good wife, and she lived a long time. Trouble was she lived too long. And he began getting a little sort of, after all, it's a big universe, and so he began finally sort of looking around, and he fell in love with his secretary. And she took him for whatever he had and ran away with her boyfriend. And he was just crushed. And finally, he sort of woke up. And when the angel appeared, he said, what now? And he said, Lord, nothing, really. All I want is that I be with you. You can give me health or no health, wealth or no wealth, wife or no wife, nothing matters. If I have you, I'll be in heaven wherever I am. And if I don't have you, I find that there's always a catch. And in fact, that's the way this world is. There's always a catch in it. And as long as we think that we're finding our solution in some little way, it will work for a while. But sooner or later, you'll find some other way of getting back in the stew again. The only way out is to discover your higher level. You won't be able to get rid of it here. The whole approach of psychology has come sort of, it's compatible with our Western bias, which is, it started out with thinking that matter is the reality. It started out with thinking that man is a sinner, and everything is sort of, the reality is the lowest, and then gradually refine that reality. Man is a sinner who, by some extraordinary grace, can be saved. Matter is the reality, but maybe it'll be sort of transformed after death if you're good, and Gabriel blows his trumpet, and then you come back out of the grave, and you're going to be living in a sort of a transformed world that's basically pretty much like this one. I had some Jehovah's Witnesses come and talk to me one time. I had my breakfast egg was frying in the frying pan when they came. It sure was hard by the time they were through. But they were talking about how if you're a Jehovah's Witness, unless you're a Jehovah's Witness, that when Gabriel blows his horn, then you will be resurrected and then you'll be living in this physical world. And I said, well, what if you've been blown to bits by a bomb? And they said, that's a good question. And then they talked about how God would, of course, manage this one by his great powers and bring you together anyway. And I said, well, listen, anybody who's got such a materialistic desire as to want to live in a physical body on a physical world for eternity is bound to have a desire to populate the world too, among other things. And if there's no further death, what's going to happen as people start standing on each other's heads? Anyway, their whole approach was so absurd when you analyze it in their own terms of materialism and a desire to live out their material desires, live out their material impulses, I should say, that it just obviously doesn't add up. But we have this bias. And so Darwin comes along, and naturally he only sees people as coming up out of the mud of our origins, that we are really sort of glorified monkeys so far. Although I understand the monkeys have pretty well rejected that theory. They don't want to think that we're... There was a story of a psychologist who decided to find out how intelligent a gorilla was. And so he suspended a banana from the ceiling, and he had a table in one corner of the room and a chair in the other corner of the room, and he figured that if the gorilla was intelligent enough, he would move the table into the center of the room and put the chair on the table and climb up on the chair and get the banana. And so he waited for 20 minutes, and then he tiptoed to the door and looked through the keyhole, and there was an eye looking back at him. The approach of psychologists also has been basically through abnormal psychology, hasn't it? That's what Freud was really studying, was abnormal psychology. And so we find that people tend to be understood in terms of abnormal psychology. The ego drives, the selfishness, the lust, the desire for power, these are the way they try to explain human nature. But there is another aspect, and all I would like to call your attention to is what the results are, which works better. If we just look at the psychological approach, we don't find people really changing that much. We find temporary changes, we find beneficial changes. Sometimes it's enough to clear one room so that somebody can go to the window and at least see his way out of the palace and maybe get out the window that way. Yes, psychology has its place, and it's done good in the respect that I said earlier. It helps to make people more honest. It helps to clear away at least what you're dealing with for now, so that if you'll go to something more, then that may be able to really help you. But as a tool in itself, it doesn't give people more than just temporary satisfaction. Like that man being born with one desire fulfilled, but sooner or later each desire had something wrong with it. It was not the final solution, and it never is. And so, what we find is that when we look to the East, and we look to the people who have meditated, we look to the people who have gone into the superconscious, then we find that they are able to overcome all their hang-ups, and in astonishing ways, and in ways that don't seem to parallel what we think, because here in the West we think that every bit of understanding has to come from some sort of a clear definition. It's got to be analyzed and defined, and then you know what it's all about. Well, there was a very intriguing story I was told about a saint in India whom I met. Sort of an astonishing fellow. He looked like the cook when I first met him. in his own ashram. He just didn't didn't seem the sort of person you'd imagine a sage to be. But as you got to know him, you found that he was really keeping it hidden. He didn't want people to know. That was his way. This woman, who was a student of his, came to him one day and said, "My son is living a dissolute life and squandering our inheritance from my husband. Can you please, please, please help him?" And the saint said, "Well, send him here." He didn't promise to help him. And the young boy came, and the saint talked to him about the different things that he did, and the boy apparently liked to drink whiskey, and the saint said, "Well, what kind?" And the boy told him. The saint said, "Oh, that other kind's much better. Try that, you'll like it." And he went to different prostitutes, and the man said, "Oh, you wouldn't like her as well. Try that one over there." And in this way he talked, just in an uncanny, incredible way. And the boy came home just bursting with glee and pride and said, "Ah, your guru, you think that your guru is going to correct me, and I find he's in my camp." And the mother was, of course, feeling a bit crushed, but the boy felt totally vindicated. Even a man of God was on his side in living this dissolute life, and he felt great, and he went to bed that night feeling great. He got up in the morning feeling great, went out and got a job, changed his whole lifestyle, gave up drinking. The saint had done a totally different thing from what the mother expected. He didn't give him any advice at all. But by the openness that he created in the boy, he was able to get into his mind and feed him a new kind of energy that made him want to live differently. And so we see that their way of working is so different from ours. And I can't say that I've ever heard a story like that one. That's a weird one. But nevertheless, I can say that the way that they work is from within. It's not from nearly so much from without. And it's really from within your own higher self. That when you attune yourself to your superconsciousness, as I've often said, the superconscious mind is solution-oriented. The conscious mind is problem-oriented. And when you think only in terms of getting rid of problems, you only create new problems, or whatever solution you find leads to new problems. Those of you who have tried any kind of creative work, if you've been successful in your creativity, then what you have done is to some extent, tap the source of superconsciousness. All great geniuses have had this experience, and many have made the statement that they felt that they derived their inspiration from above. It wasn't something that they created out of their own minds. I was listening to one of the players in the San Francisco Symphony had composed something, and so they played it out of courtesy to him at one of the concerts in San Francisco. And it was such a mind-born thing that it had no joy, no love, no anything. It was just sort of, well, this is an a succession of notes to put, and here would be a good idea to do this now, and let's have the horns for a while. Now it's time for the flutes. And, we've been neglecting the violins, all right. And it just sort of went like that. I felt badly for the man because the first violinist wasn't polite enough to applaud him afterwards. And it seemed unkind. But nevertheless, it was lousy music. And what made it lousy was simply that it came out of his mind. It didn't come out of his soul. And that's the whole difference, that if you do things from your mind, they won't be inspired. If you do things from the soul, you're drawing from a source that isn't your own. You just allow it to happen. I know when I was performing the wedding for Kalyani and Nitai a year ago, I was letting things just come through me, and I said afterwards, I was thinking as they were going through, gee, that's pretty good, I wish I'd thought of that one. But that's really the way that one feels when one works from inspiration, that something is just happening and you just are a contented witness of the whole thing, allowing it to happen, allowing it to flow through you, but you're not doing it. And this is the difference between mind-born activity and soul-born activity. What we want to do is get in touch with the higher self, because that is the way to really solve all our problems. Once you get, I'll tell you something. 10 years ago, I went to India. And I don't know whether it was because of one or another of the saints that I met, like maybe Satya Sai Baba or this other peculiar saint that I talked about, or whether it was just my own time in myself or whatever it might be. But suddenly I found that I just didn't feel defensive about anything anymore. And it's strange because you never see these things. They're so close to you that you don't see that you've got them until you're rid of them. And suddenly you look at it and you say, my goodness, what was that? I would sometimes, if people would say things that I didn't like, resent it, and so on. And suddenly I found that I couldn't care less. If somebody wanted to accuse me a lot of things, it just wasn't my problem. It was his problem. And if it was true and was my problem, his saying so didn't make it more my problem. And so I should be grateful to him for saying it rather than defensive about it. The intriguing thing about it was that kind of blessing, because it came from the superconscious level, was a permanent one. It's just there. Any kind of thing that you get that's from a superconscious level is permanent. And anything that you get from an ordinary level of affirmation that, oh, I'm going to go so and be so, and you wake up one morning and you say, from now on I'm going to be this way, and you may put out enough energy for it to be that way for a while, but it'll come in some other way again. It's as Jesus said to the woman of Samaria, who drinks of this water shall thirst again, but who drinks of the water I shall give him shall never thirst again. And that's the way it is, that not only on the final level, that when you fulfill worldly desires, then you naturally get thirsty again for something else. And therefore, when you get into the divine consciousness, you reach a level where all desires are fulfilled permanently because you're in eternal and absolute bliss. And so nothing can ever happen then, even on a more relative term, that though you may not have eternal bliss, some little quality that you've been working on, if you get it from the superconscious, then it's permanent there for you. That's one thing that you've mastered, that you've learned. Or as Yogananda put it with chanting, he said if you repeat a chant over and over and over until you take it beyond the subconscious, the conscious into the superconscious, then whenever you sing that song, it'll give you a superconscious experience. Because you've spiritualized it once, it will remain permanently a spiritual experience for you. Or some little experience that I had as a child that I used to have in bed as I went to sleep. And then years later got it again in meditation. I had often wondered, what was that experience during this whole many years between the two? And yet when I had it again, it was as if I'd had it just as if I'd never left it. It's a permanent reality. And that again is true. Patanjali said that in fact he gave as his definition of enlightenment the word smriti. Smriti means memory. That you remember who you always were. And here you've gone, your 5 to 8 million lifetime incarnation stint in lower life forms, and you've managed to be at your post for another who knows how many million lifetimes as a human ego. And you might say that in human terms of reckoning, a few billion years amounts to a reasonably long time, right? When you get a touch of superconsciousness, it's as if, well, of course. You never left it. You just recognize it as who you really are. The memory is instant. It's not, oh yes, I seem to remember maybe. No, it's not like that at all. You get a taste of love in meditation. Of course, this is what I am. And I remember once after meditating for a few months, we at Mount Washington would leave our work at noon, And I would go down to the dining room and put my food aside, and then I would just go and meditate for half an hour. And about 25 minutes had gone by in my meditation, and suddenly I felt this great joy here at the point between the eyebrows. And it felt so absolutely homey, so natural. I just thought, well, of course. And, oh, I won't lose this again. Well, I didn't have it deeply enough. I hadn't really gotten into it. And so I thought, well, it's lunchtime, and I left it. It wasn't that easy to get back. But the feeling that I had when I had it was, well, of course. Because this is who you really are. And when you get an experience in meditation of ecstasy or anything, you don't grab notepaper and pencil and, I got to remember this one and write it down. Because as soon as you have it, you just know that nothing else is real. That is who you really are. Now, the Indian psychology, if you want to use it, and this is simply attributing a Western word to the Indian system, but the Indian approach to it all is to not try to straighten out a scene that can never be straightened out. It will always have something going wrong in one way or another. The Indian approach is to say we have 3 levels of mind, not just 2. It's not just that we have a subconscious mind that is feeding things to the conscious and that needs smoothing out on in certain ways so that you can go a straight line to whatever it is you're trying to become, like president of the corporation or a happy father or whatever. No, the Indian approach says that the only way out of it is to use whatever concentration you can get, whatever mental clarity you can get, to be able to go into the superconsciousness and become established in the superconscious. Because in fact you can only understand a thing unless you can only understand it when you are able to look at it from above. We need to be honest with ourselves. We need to see ourselves as we are, but we'll never really see ourselves as we are as long as we are that same self that we're trying to see. The mind is poisoned with the very delusions it's trying to overcome. That thing I was talking about, that blessing I received in 1972, I couldn't see it until I was out of it. We can't really see ourselves clearly as long as the mind is poisoned with the very disease it's trying to overcome. Because it'll somehow look right to you. You're too close. And so how to get out of it? Well, you can only get out of it by getting out of the mind itself. And you can only get out of the mind itself by getting into the superconsciousness by meditation. And so meditation is the essence of Indian psychology as a practice to get you into the experience from which everything else comes clear. But the Indian and the Western methods really do need to be united for the clearest understanding. Because the Indian emphasis on just superconscious doesn't take into account this sort of ball around our foot, holding us down when we would like to sprint. And so it is that many people who take up meditation but aren't aware of this seething mass of subconscious and so on complexes, they don't know what's holding them back from being able to meditate well. And if they could learn to examine themselves more clearly, if they could learn to look at themselves in the Western approach of just being honest with who you are, recognizing that you don't only have that higher aspiration, but you've also got this lower hypnosis pulling you back. To unite these two systems is really the ideal. This is the kind of age that we're living in right now. We're living in an age where the Eastern and the Western virtues are becoming balanced and harmonized. Each has developed something that he can give to the other. And the Western psychology, well, that's something very new, and you might say that it's sort of kindergarten yoga in many ways, but it is at the same time the product of a whole civilization that has been developing over thousands of years. Mankind can't have been around that long without learning a few lessons in at least this particular context. as far as the worldly scene goes, we've got it together better than they have. And that is partly not from the ancient times. India is a very, very old culture. It goes far back into prehistory. Back 5,000 years ago, there are figurines that have been discovered sitting in yoga postures and doing various yoga positions. They knew the things that yogis teach today. It's a very old science. Yogananda told me that it was also a very rich culture, that there was a time many centuries ago when they would eat off of gold plates and throw the plates away the way we throw paper plates away. Just throw them into the river. They were, even in the time of Marco Polo, he described his visits to the Chinese court, and then he came back to Italy by way of India. And he said, in a book that I have, I've read his accounts, and he said that there is no country in the world as wealthy as India. The riches of India were legendary, but then along came the English. And England became wealthy and India became poor. And one thinks there may be a cause and effect relationship there. The jewels taken off the Taj Mahal appearing in the crown of the king and so on. India was put down by foreign cultures. It was put down first of all by the Muslims. Aurangzeb, the Muslim conqueror, demanded a mond, that means 80 pounds, of Brahminical threads every day. Well, you imagine how many Brahminical threads it would take to produce 80 pounds, a small mountain. And they could get it by one of only two ways. One was to convert them, and the other was to slaughter them. And they were slaughtered in tens and tens of thousands. So what did the poor Indians do? They gradually developed a sort of life-negating attitude. It was a natural response to this kind of influence that made it impossible for them to find anything except in the higher worlds. They emphasized negating life, saying it's all unreal anyway, so why pay any attention to it? Just go off to the caves, meditate. And more and more, a sort of life-negating attitude crept into the culture, which was there until quite recently. Now the masters are again talking in terms of affirming life, but affirming it in a higher octave, or affirming it as a divine life. Swami Shivananda's society is called the Divine Life Society, and Aurobindo's the Life Divine, and Yogananda's affirmation of life. He was, of all the saints I've met, of all the people I've met, he was outstanding in his ability to say yes to life. But if we read the scriptures, we find they too are very life-affirming. There's one Upanishad that begins saying you should live in this world without attachment, and with this attitude wish to live in it 100 years enjoying it. After all, this world is to be enjoyed, but enjoyed in the right way. And to say, no, it's evil, it's wrong, this has been a tendency that has grown. There was a saint in India who told me that you should not enjoy beautiful music. You should not enjoy a lovely sunset, because this enmeshes you in the senses, enmeshes you in delusion, and you should just close off all ability to enjoy. Well, this is certainly not the teaching of my guru, nor is it the teaching of the great gurus that I have met, who do emphasize the need to affirm God in everything and not develop a sort of a cold attitude toward everything in the name of uniting your soul with the source of all sweetness. The two just don't go together. The two attitudes are mutually exclusive. There certainly is something to be said. If I'm going to choose which one to concentrate on, then I'll say, well, let me choose the inner, not the outer. But those people who have this sort of closed-in attitude tend to become closed in their consciousness and not just focused. And it does work for some people, but it doesn't seem to work for very, very many. I have to say it would suffocate me. To me, to be able to celebrate the beauty of God in nature and in people is just a part of my devotion. And that is our path. But that attitude, you can see how it would develop. It would develop naturally from finding yourself put in a position where that's the only way out anyway. And here in the West, we have had so much need to involve ourselves in outward conquest, outward success, and so on, that we have tended to forget the inner life. Now we've come to a time when both of these are being united. And the unity can be expressed in many ways. One of them is this unity between the Indian approach to the psyche and the Western. The approach from below and the approach from above. They're both valid and each can help the other. If, however, you spend your time just trying to analyze yourself, trying to pick apart your motives and everything, you'll find you never get anywhere. If, on the other hand, you try to get into superconsciousness or a higher state of consciousness and then look down from that state into the mind, then you will find that has to be done too. You don't get to liberation only by going into the superconscious. You also get into it by using your superconscious awareness to straighten out this house. At that point you can see how big the palace is. At that point you can really come in and see that I need to sweep that dirt out of the palace, not just into other parts of the palace, or if into other parts of the palace, then find out where the door is so I can get it all moving in the right direction and not just sort of coming back on itself. And this, without divine grace, without the help of the Guru, it just doesn't happen. You can't get out of this labyrinth that way. So, meditation is the way. Meditation and raising the consciousness to the level where you are enlightened enough to be able to see what the implications are. In fact, a great yogi is able to view an entire incarnation in vision and just sit back and watch his lessons. You'll never be able to understand unless you can develop that kind of watchful state, looking at yourself rather than being totally involved in yourself. This too would be a part of the Indian kind of psychology. Standing back and observing the way your mind works rather than just going through it. And then getting into the flow of joy. Remember, a really important point psychologically is that you can never understand people truly if you try to understand them only analytically. You can only understand people with your heart. You can only understand them if you have a really kind feeling in your heart. If you just sit back there and pick them to pieces, you can perhaps see mechanically how they tick. But you won't be able to really know who they are. You won't be able to help them either. If you have this very kind feeling toward them, you'll begin to identify with them. And from that, they say, don't judge another person until you've walked a mile in his moccasins. That was an American Indian saying, and a very good one. To understand another person means to be able to see him from within himself rather than just analytically from outside. And the same is true for you. You won't be able to understand yourself until you really accept yourself as you are, until you love yourself. There has to be some level to love within you. Even if it doesn't seem possible, there has to be, because you're a child of God. This tendency to keep talking about the lower part of our nature and say that I'm so bad because I'm selfish. I'm so bad because I'm constantly saying unkind things to people. I'm so bad because I just don't know how to hold my tongue. I'm so bad because this, that, and the other thing. This isn't going to help you to overcome it. You must find that space within yourself that is indeed lovable. And it exists in the worst person in the world, what to speak of people who would come to a spiritual discourse. And yet, how many people in this country, how many people on the spiritual path don't really like themselves. They have enough honesty and divine aspiration to want to see themselves as they are, and once they've seen themselves steadily and seen themselves whole, they don't like it. Well, there's more to it than that. Will you be able to get out of it by just thinking about the unlikable parts? You won't. But you will be able to get out of it if you think of that part of yourself which is divine. After all, there is aspiration. You want to seek God. And if you have not any other virtue but that puts you leagues ahead of all the virtuous people in the world who don't want to seek God. Because it's the only virtue that finally gets you to supreme virtue. Other virtues just sort of keep you going. They're like the road to Hades being paved with good intentions. St. Otto of Cluny said that the floor of hell is paved with the bald pates of clergymen. And things must have been pretty bad in those days. Anyway, you can't get out of it just looking at it from that standpoint, that if you really can see that inside there is this divine aspiration, that is the supreme virtue. A murderer, the worst kind of criminal, if he loves God, must be considered, spiritually speaking, ahead of those people who wouldn't dream of committing crime but never dream of God either. So the fact that you have that already commands divine attention, and that's why you're drawn to spiritual places. That's why you're drawn to spiritual opportunities, because you've put out that energy first. You've created the magnet. Then give strength to that magnet. It's that magnet that's going to draw things to you. We can't solve our own problems. We can only open the windows of our mind so that God can come in and help us, show us how. One little touch of divine grace and you suddenly find that there's something been lifted from you that you didn't even have to work on. Like that young man who came to that saint. He didn't have to try, but he was open enough so that the saint was able to put vibrations into his mind that he became a different person. Make it a point also to be with people who are on the path and are trying to seek higher values, because their magnetism united with your own will help all of you. And to live in worldly environments, sooner or later, even good people tend to become sort of cynical and think, well, really it's all a dream, good people aren't good. And they just start to see the darkness in everything. This is the way of delusion. The two ways, delusion and the mind under the influence of delusion, can go even into the best place and find something wrong with it. And the mind that is under the influence of the divine, the mind that is really in a state of that yoga practice seeks to give, can go into the worst place and find something good. It reminds me of Yogananda coming to our dining room one time, the monks' dining room at Mount Washington, and it was a mess. And he said, well, it could be worse. I have to admit, I don't know how, but anyway. That kind of attitude you will find when you mix with saints, that they always see the potential for good. They always see the potential for higher things in people. And they always try to encourage that potential. They try to help people to become that. In fact, a saint can almost be discovered from his ability to inspire in other people faith in their own saintliness. Because we're all basically saints. We just haven't found it out yet. We haven't developed that smriti that Patanjali talked about. We haven't remembered who we really are. But every one of us, just as much as Jesus Christ and Buddha and Krishna and everyone else, every one of us is a child of God. And if we can learn to approach our lives in the superconscious way and learn to love that aspect of our lives, not the deluded side, but that aspect which aspires to the highest, living in that consciousness, then we will find that we have the power to start really to work seriously on this cluttered up palace of ours of a mind. then we can start to really weed out all the unwanted plants in our garden and to come free. It all begins from the heights, not from the depths. You can understand man in terms of his expression, of his being an expression of God. You'll never be able to understand him if you think of him only as this complex web of subconscious tendencies and cross tendencies. And so I'd like to go on and talk, as Anandi was saying. What were you saying I was supposed to talk about? What's that? How to deepen your meditation. Ah, yes. How to deepen your meditation. I'm all for it. But I think maybe what you'd like to do is take 5, and then we'll come back and do that.